Hi, everybody. Welcome. Um, we are really pleased to have you with us today. My name is Alex DiBranco. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. We are really glad to have you here with us today to discuss the report that was co-published with New America, authored by Megan Kelly, Dr. Julia DeCook, and myself. Um, and in discussion with our two discussants who have also written a political science article about understanding incels and violence. Thank the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies for co-sponsoring this event with us as well today. Questions from participants for the panelists that come up during the course of the event can be added using the Q&A function because of the sensitivity of this topic and that it tends to attract harassment. The chat function itself is disabled for participants, but we will be monitoring the Q&A. And so I am going to begin by introducing our first speaker. We will have a few short commentaries from our panelists, and then the panelists will discuss and ask questions of one another, and then invite questions and answer from the audience. So I'm very pleased to welcome my colleague, Dr. Julia DeCook. Julia is a board member at the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, and she is also an assistant professor in the School of Communication at Loyola University Chicago. She earned her PhD from Michigan State University with a dissertation research that asks what the role of platforms and infrastructure are in sustaining misogynist book that will also discuss the dissertation coming out eventually as well. So thank you, Julia, for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Alex, and thank you everyone for being here today. My comments are actually going to be focusing more on the events that transpired in Atlanta now 2 days ago. A white man targeted Asian-owned massage parlors and killed 8 people, 6 of them being Asian women. Much of the conversation has focused on whether or not this was a racially motivated attack or one that was motivated by misogyny. And many are pointing out that it's both. And unfortunately, as many of you may be aware, some of the early justifications for his attacks from the sheriff's department have pointed to the fact that this man claims that he has a sex addiction and that he was just having a bad day. As many people can imagine, this is kind of a, obvious example of how white supremacy sustains itself by, a white sheriff that justifying the violent actions of another white man. However, being an Asian American woman myself, the attacks are just one of the most violent examples of anti-Asian racism that we've seen emerge during the COVID-19 pandemic that has been growing in recent years due to increased rhetoric of anti-China, anti-Asian sentiment that has been ramping up, particularly during the Trump presidency. However, it's really important to note that this was an attack on Asian women, that this man felt that he needed to inflict on them due to the fact that he wanted to eliminate them as a source of temptation for his quote unquote sex addiction. Obviously, there are a lot of factors here, but white supremacy, misogyny, Christian fundamentalism, and ideas of purity and being the people who enforce morality are all things that are deeply intertwined in this killer's actions. I would also like to take a moment and to reflect on the lives that were lost. And I hope that those of you who are in the Asian American community are taking the time to take care of yourselves and to also acknowledge that this is just one more hate incident, and there's been more reports of it happening. And Stop AAPI Hate actually came out with a report recently on the day of the shooting, actually, that hate incidents are nearing almost 4,000 since the pandemic began and they started reporting them. And women report hate crimes at double the rate of Asian men. And so this is just another example of how Asian women are disproportionately targeted by racist, misogynistic violence. And I believe that the report that we wrote about does briefly touch on the issue of race within incel communities. But the thing is that a lot of people try to label this as an incel attack simply because it was misogynistic, but misogyny and incels are two separate things. Incels don't equal misogynist. Misogyny is what causes people to adopt incel ideology and beliefs. And so I think this panel is a much needed part of the conversation that we're having right now in light of the recent events. And I want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Julia. So one of our co-authors, Megan Kelly, is based in Europe, where it is very late at night tonight. And so she provided us with some recorded comments on the report that we will play to be a part of the conversation. Megan Kelly is one of our co-authors on the report and a PhD student at the Center for Gender Studies at the University of Basel. She's an IRMS fellow. Her dissertation analyzes red pill and black pill narratives as radicalization narratives into male supremacism.
Hello everyone, my name is Megan Kelly, and I am a fellow and co-founder at the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, and I am also a PhD candidate at the University of Basel, where my research looks at red pill and black pill narratives as radicalization narratives to male supremacism, and specifically I'm looking at misogynist incels and MGTOWs, or men going their own ways, radicalization narratives. Previously, for my master's thesis, I conducted a digital ethnography of 2 incel forums, both misogynist incel forums, where I looked at identity formation, violence, specifically promotions of violence, and gatekeeping on these 2 misogynist incel forums. For my comments on our report, I wanted to share a bit about our motivation in writing this report, and briefly on the misogyny and dehumanization of women that happens in misogynist incel forums. So this report came about largely because we had noticed increasing coverage and interest in online incel communities, especially as misogynist incels have perpetrated several violent extremist attacks. However, we found that some emerging work on misogynist incels and proposed preventative and counter-violent extremist interventions seem to miss the mark in identifying the role that misogyny plays in the online incel community and in understanding how misogyny operates more broadly in our society. And that some of the suggested tactics and interventions to address misogynist incel violence seem to include potentially pushing incels to different types of misogyny, as it did not address the underlying misogynistic motivations that unites this group. We also noticed that there's been a tendency to not call misogynistic violence misogyny or male supremacist violence, and instead call it incel violence, even if the perpetrator did not identify as an incel, and even if the perpetrator was not part of any kind of misogynist incel space or community. But just simply by having misogynist motivation, they were called incel instead of calling them a male supremacist or being motivated by misogyny. And that problem with the mislabeling with calling anyone associated with misogyny an incel is that, one, it muddles our understanding of misogynist incels and therefore can result in flawed recommendations on how to prevent violence coming out of this community. And second, it fails to recognize the broader spectrum of misogyny, which also gives the false impression that misogynist incels and their beliefs exist in a vacuum and are not a product of the society and this society's values around them and the society they live in. So in our brief, we wanted to address that misogyny is not unique to incels and that male supremacism operates on a spectrum, where misogynist incels cannot be separated from broader societal patterns of misogyny. Misogyny is what unites various male supremacist groups. These groups including pickup artists, men's rights activists, red pillars, and men going their own way are united by the belief, often called the red pill, that men are true victims and that women, especially enabled by feminism, are the oppressors of men and hold societal, political, and sexual power over men. While these groups have different reactions to this belief, they all portray women as stupid, irrational, manipulative animals, morally bankrupt, and portray women as beholden to their natural impulses. And in doing so, also portray women as only existing for the purpose of sexual and romantic objects for men. Misogynist incels take this misogyny and dehumanization even further by explicitly celebrating violence against women, usually by celebrating mass murderers or serial killers that targeted women, calling these men saints. They also call for the legalization of rape and torture of women in some cases, for women's perceived sexual promiscuity, and also sometimes support ideas such as enforced monogamy, which would have women forcibly assigned as sexual partners to men. This dehumanization of misogyny can also be seen in the language that incels use when talking about women. So not calling women women, but holes or roasties or femoid and void, which actively dehumanizes and objectifies women. Misogynist incels express that women are at fault for the suffering and misery of incels, which is similar to other male supremacist groups. But misogynist incels really hit on this point that women are then deserving of ridicule and punishment and violence against them as a result, which you sometimes see in other male supremacist groups, but is perhaps most visible among misogynist incels. While misogynist incels and other male supremacist groups use more extreme and dehumanizing language and glorification of violence, their belief systems and ideologies are developed from and supported by the cultural and societal context in which they live. They're not created in a vacuum. And that culture in which they live is one that fails to mitigate violence against women and girls and values women only for the sexual romantic fulfillment of men and teaches men that they are entitled to women for this fulfillment. And so because of this, it's incredibly necessary to not only understand misogyny and how it appears in misogynist incel spaces, but also how these broader cultural ideas are feeding in to the development of this extremist identity and ideology.
Thank you. So more details are available in the report about what Megan discussed. We go into significant depth in explaining how dehumanization is used, the foundational manifesto for the movement, the glorification of violence, and other kinds of rhetoric. And so we encourage people to look at the report itself. I am going to, in this conversation, focus in on our recommendation section as the element that I most want to highlight in this conversation, and then introduce our colleagues to have a conversation and give their thoughts from their own areas of expertise. We actually had these recommendations have been published as well today in Ms. Magazine, and we are hoping that they will have an influence on the way that we discuss these issues. And so we have oriented our recommendations around 5 key points, based on both what we have seen in the existing literature about misogynist incels and violence and how to address it, and also then our own research and what appears important. In this narrative, we recommend that support for improved health services and access is a social good, but it is not a solution to ideological violence. And we have seen many countering violent extremism and counterterrorism experts framing this as a mental health issue, and focusing in on that concept. And this is a misunderstanding of how ideologically motivated violence works and what the framework is that is used to counter ideology. Though many misogynist incel men refuse therapy, viewing it as an ineffective solution to what they view as the injustices against them, others have tried therapy but retain their misogynist ideology and return to these online communities. And so this, while mental health services could likely be improved and should be in terms of understanding and dealing with misogyny, racism, and other issues that motivate people's thinking, in general, mental health services are simply not a space that is designed to treat an ideology, because misogyny, supremacism, and other harmful ideologies are not mental health issues. And so it's very important that we start by distinguishing those two things. Part of this also goes into the terminology that we use around this conversation, in which we distinguish misogynist incel ideology from simply what is incel. Our report discusses the history of the incel community, which was founded by a bisexual woman in Toronto and is not rooted in misogynist ideology. And so some of the aspects of what are discussed in the countering violent extremism literature as potential ways to help people who self-identify voluntarily celibate are really not answers to what is a male supremacist ideology that has evolved. Our second recommendation coming off of that is, instead, there are examples of specialized counseling programs designed to deal with countering racist violence in the de-radicalization sphere, and also dealing with domestic abuse perpetrators. And because we are very aware of some of the flaws in existing de-radicalization programs aimed at so-called extremist ideologies, we think that it's really important that any such programs be designed with a feminist informed perspective, as that used in domestic abuse perpetrator intervention programs. It is particularly alarming to have seen in recommendations from countering violent extremism organizations that helping misogynist incel men form intimate relations with women will somehow mitigate their desire for dominance just by the very fact of having that relationship. This completely ignores the wider violence perpetrated by men disproportionately against women in intimate relationships, and a similarity in the beliefs shared by misogynist incels, domestic abuse perpetrators, and other forms of male supremacists and male supremacist belief systems. Domestic abuse perpetrators typically feel entitled. They feel wronged as victims when they do not get what they want, and they feel justified in committing violence in response. They have typically sexist, patriarchal views of the roles of men and women. And we see similar elements in misogynist incel ideology. And so we really recommend that misogynist mass violence be understood as existing on a continuum, along with other gender-based harassment and violence, including intimate partner abuse, stalking, rape, and murder, that these are elements of the same misogynist ideologies. Thirdly, we encourage intervention programs to be careful boys and men's own sense of entitlement and prioritize collaborations with gender justice organizations to strengthen program design. Given that misogynist violence is only recently becoming recognized in the countering violent extremism and counterterrorism fields, organizations often lack experts who are versed in issues like violence against women, male supremacism, and misogyny, gaps that we have seen reflected in their analysis. Important, therefore, to support collaborative projects that are bringing into coalition organizations embedded in feminist and gender justice frameworks in order to avoid inadvertently supporting boys' and men's entitlement and other errors that reinforce male supremacism. Examples of these programs are those in which men and boys are given the impression that by learning a script in order to perform what should be kind of basic decency, that will result in them gaining access to women's attention and or bodies. And when they follow the script based on operating with a certain level of at least feigned respect because they expect a reward at the end, rather than a sense of empathy and the humanity of the girls and women in their lives, this can actually lead them to be further radicalized toward a more extreme violent misogyny when that does not come to part. Our fourth recommendation is to intervene early and through routine systems to prevent movement along a spectrum of dehumanization and misogyny towards violent extremes. And we want to thank our colleagues who have joined us today because their 2020 Political Science Journal article, co-authored as well with Katie Atwell, emphasizes the importance of intervention through routine systems, understanding those structures, and solving some of the pitfalls of the contemporary responses to gender-based violence more broadly through these kinds of community and educational interventions. Given that participants in misogynist forums often join beginning in their teenage years, effective prevention strategies necessitate intervention starting in childhood that are formed early on, dealing with, for instance, problematic English literature curricula in schools that reinforce male entitlement and sympathize with male frustration, ignore consent, and present women as dehumanized, objectified props or fantasies, providing comprehensive consent-based sexuality education rather than the kinds of abstinence-only education that exists in some school districts that traffic in gender stereotypes, including the idea that boys and men have uncontrollable urges and that girls and women are responsible for appearing chaste and for keeping men from acting on those urges and for keeping men from being tempted by them, which is we can see echoed this week in the shootings in Georgia, in which the perpetrator claims that he wanted to eliminate temptation that kind of sense emerging in that act of violence. And our last recommendation is an important call that there simply needs to be significantly more funding into research and collaborations into male supremacism broadly, and protections for researchers' ability to work in the face of threats and doxing. While most of the recent acts of misogynist mass violence have been connected to incel ideology, there are other acts of misogynist mass violence that are connected to other belief systems. And of course, the attack on Tuesday, which occurred after we wrote the recommendations for this report, and the timing of that really indicates, now the most fatal act of mass violence in the United States of the past year, connected to a different ideology. There have also been there is an attack in 2020 connected to the men's rights movement and men going their own way. And so we think that it's important not to focus just on incels, as Julia brought up in her original commentary, and seeing the idea of just turning to talking about incels as some fringe other, rather than the manifold versions of misogyny that appear both in mainstream society and in organized movements. And in thinking about tech solutions to misogyny, racism, and other forms of hateful or dehumanizing speech, while many of these interventions have focused on deplatforming perpetrators as a way to deal with this, individuals doing research in this area, particularly women and women of color, are subject to harassment and doxing through doing this work, which can make it difficult and impact the ability for researchers to work in this area. And so we recommend more investment in creating security protocols and services and supporting those for researchers doing public work in this area, to allow them to have voices and as a different way of thinking about how to protect free speech. And we want to mention that we do thank the Urgent Action Fund for Women's Rights, because they do make grant making towards digital security protections for people working within the women's rights field, and the co-authors of this report have benefited from that. So now I am going to turn to our discussants, who I am very excited woke up very early in Australia to speak with us today. And to begin with, we welcome Dr. Sian Tomkinson. She is completed her PhD in Gender and Game Studies at the University of Western Australia. Her work focuses on examining the role that gender plays in culture and communities, and in particular, how digital communities develop toxic characteristics. Along with our other speaker today, Tal Harper, and their co-author, Katie Atwell, they are authors of the 2020 political science article, Confronting Incel, Exploring Possible Policy Responses to Misogynistic Violent Extremism. So welcome, Sian. We're so glad to have you today.
Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give a brief overview of our paper in the time that we have, and then Tal will be able to unpack it in a little bit more detail and fill in anything he feels should be explained a little bit more. So to give an overview of our paper, basically we have three key arguments. Firstly, that incel does constitute violent extremism, that states should securitize misogynistic violence to allocate the necessary resources to prevent further attacks, and also that we should learn our lessons from other attempts to securitize violent extremism when we say we should securitize incels. There's a few reasons why we want to use securitization. Firstly, securitization, it elevates the threat above gender wars, because quite often, obviously in the US but also in Australia, we see situations where a woman is raped and murdered and it's discussed as a private issue and not a public issue. And then it just becomes arguments about gender rather than anything else. So we say, okay, if we securitize incel, we say, okay, let's elevate it above these people complaining in Parliament that doesn't really get anywhere, and let's say, yes, it's a public threat and something we should all be concerned about. Also, securitization allows us to allocate resources, which, as you mentioned, raw resources would be fantastic to deal with this kind of issue. And also, if we understand incel's security threat, we can use policies that already exist in a lot of areas to tackle public security issues. But it's quite important for us to recognize that when we say securitization, we're not using it in the super traditional way. So quite traditionally, securitization is something that involves maybe using violence, maybe using quite extreme forms of intervention. But for us, when we say securitization, we're more talking about issue cultures and saying, okay, this issue goes, we're not debating whether it's a problem or not anymore, we're just accepting it's a problem and something that needs to be dealt with. Yeah, so what we suggest to do in order to tackle the issue of incel extremism, there's 3 kinds of interventions that we are quite interested in, but we are really mostly interested in the primary and secondary interventions. So primary interventions are about setting social norms and encouraging social awareness and solidarity. This would mean addressing misogyny as a community problem. And part of this is trying to avoid stigmatizing certain groups, because as we've seen, when other issues have been securitized, like Islamic extremism and things like that, we end up with a suspect community. And then these people feel more victimized, they feel more angry, they already feel disconnected from other people. And if they get targeted as a suspect community, then they feel even more this way, and there's more increased chance of extremism occurring. So firstly, we do want to address misogyny as a community problem rather than saying to these people, okay, you're the problem, we're going to investigate you. And for us, this would mean looking at politicians, public opinion leaders and the media, things like condemning politicians who undermine action on gender violence and people who sort of reaffirm incels' feelings. We had a few incidents in Australia fairly recently, and people who spoke out about it, there was a police commissioner and some other people, and the things that were saying, sort of, it was victim blaming kind of comments, things like that. And we need to say, no, like these kinds of comments are problematic, they fuel these kinds of issues. We're also interested in promoting women's interests in politics in the public sphere. Again, educating community workers, police, politicians, teachers, try to like understand the issue of victim blaming and understand the need to address misogyny. And in general, programs that tackle social isolation for all kinds of people, because it does seem like incels, of course, absolutely, there's this misogynist ideology that dominates everything, but these people, they are feeling like disconnected from other people, they feel like society's let them down and all these kinds of things. In general, we have a broader problem where people, you know, you say as much as we are more connected than ever before, people also feel very lonely and disconnected from each other, and that is a broader problem. So those primary interventions are the ones we're most optimistic about. Then we have these secondary interventions, and that's intervening when people become radicalized. So the idea here is identifying people who are at risk and then engaging them in support programs. And this is kind of where we feel there is a risk of creating a suspect community, which could make people feel more alienated because we're targeting certain groups. But there's a whole bunch of risk factors. In our article, we talk about them. There's a lot of research on this. But things like people who disconnect themselves from others, maybe they've been bullied, have low self-esteem, feelings of underachievement, quite obviously from recent instances as well, like engagement with alt-right or far-right groups that some quite often do have links with misogynistic attitudes. These kinds of things are suggested to be indicators that it's possible that somebody will commit violence. Not necessarily they will, but indication. We are aware that there have been support programs for de-radicalization that's worked fairly well for neo-Nazi people, white supremacists, Islamic jihadists in Europe and the US. So we're hoping those sorts of things we hope could work in this situation. And specifically here, we're thinking about providing new gender scripts. So talking about behavior and establishing what kind of behavior is and isn't acceptable. And this, I can't remember off the top of my head, but in our article, we do talk about it. There's a specific incident, I think it was in Europe, where it worked, that kind of thing works quite effectively. I think it was for domestic violence people. And then there's the tertiary interventions, which are the ones that securitization is most often associated with, but we're like, no, we don't want tertiary so much, because tertiary is surveillance of people engaging in suspect behavior, that have a high risk profile. It's kind of that more extreme intervention that will absolutely alienate people and is very costly. And it's kind of at the last possible moment before someone is likely to commit an attack. Whereas we're hoping with primary and secondary interventions that you can sort of anticipate that and prevent people from becoming to the point where they get to the tertiary stage where they're likely to commit an attack. So yeah, that's my overview of our article. Maybe Tal would like to make some comments to unpack a bit more.
Thank you so much. Yes, we are glad to also have with us today Tal Harper, a lecturer in media and communication at UWA. Tal's broad research area is technology and public communication and includes work on communication technology, online radicalization, critical theory, education, democracy, and theories of play. So welcome and thank you as well for joining us.
Hi everyone. Thanks very much for having us. It's delightful to have such a community of scholars and the public that's interested in this topic. I think Sian did a really good job of unpacking our argument. I think what I'd just say to add is to say, look, what we thought we were doing was something really clever here. We were actually motivated by a particularly vicious attack on a lone woman walking at night, where we just thought, look, something's got to be done. And it was motivated in a way about the way in which the political discussion about these attacks broke down into these kind of gender wars of, well, not all men, versus this is a gender problem, or this is something women are inviting upon themselves, terrible stuff. Which we found completely unproductive. And so what we thought is Incel presents in a way an opportunity to kind of re-articulate gendered violence and misogynistic violence as a broad social problem. And don't get me wrong, I'm completely aware that gendered violence is a broad social problem, and some colleagues of ours, Mel Johnson and Jackie True, argue that it's at, like, misogyny in general is at the base of all extremist violence. So those arguments are out there, but we were more concerned about partner abuse, domestic violence as well, and simple like sexual violence and violence against women in general. We thought Incel did this really interesting thing where they made misogynistic violence, instead of just being a threat against women, it's now a public threat, because incels kill everyone, right? The really interesting thing is all of a sudden they're like other forms of violent extremism, they're killing indiscriminately in order to kind of gain attention for what they're doing. And that has always been a trigger in the past for governments to kind of say, okay, we have to do something about this. And so we thought, well, surely if they're going to, if our government is going to police things like religious extremism so vehemently, they will also want to police misogynistic extremism so vehemently as well. And of course, then we went back and kind of compared it and said, okay, is this kind of incel misogynistic violence similar to other forms of violent extremism and ideological extremism? And yes, it is. Then what's the best possible way to deal with that from a policy perspective? And it was obviously at that point we realized how horribly governments have conducted campaigns and policy against Islamic extremism and all the failures that have been involved in that. And so what we did then is kind of go through the policies and say, okay, well, what would be the best approach to doing this so as not to create a suspect community here, so as not to allow it just to devolve into gender wars, and to make sure that, yes, we actually have some levers to pull and some, a list of things to do that we can do in order to make sure we reduce the risk of misogyny to both the public and to women as well. And yeah, look, as Sian detailed really well, a lot of the evidence suggests that it is dealing with it on an ideological level is absolutely crucial. And it seems that that's what your report is suggesting as well, to actually think about this as like, well, if you don't deal with the ideological roots of this extremism in some way, you're never going to deal with it. And certainly doing the thing where you wait until somebody's about to, pull a gun or pull a knife is waiting till it's too late. Although it was fascinating, it was just fascinating to do the research and find, like, in the United States, for instance, they brag about their capacities. They've got these like fusion centers of high intelligent kind of security operations where they can like detect anybody that's doing anything that's possibly to do with Islamic extremism, and yet they're not applying that to misogynistic extremism. And it's like, well, if not, why not? And so, but that's, yeah, the tertiary phase. Really for us, it was about having a way to say to public figures, politicians, and thought leaders, every time that you say something that either makes men feel more persecuted or makes violence against women seem more justified, you are actually doing something that encourages terrorism, that encourages a security threat to the public of Australia or the public of the world, and hoping then that censure causes people to think more carefully about statements that they make. So yes, I'll leave it there and leave it open to questions. I do think Sian dealt with the article fairly well.
Thank you, wonderful. So we do have a few questions from the audience already, and I encourage people to continue to share. But first, I want to give our panelists the opportunity to raise any questions to one another that they would be interested in following up on or discussing further. Go ahead, Tal.
One of the things that Julia mentioned, I just kind of thought it was interesting because one of the things we realized when you said that helping misogynists form intimate relationships with women does not help, one of the things that we kind of always kind of said as a writing team is like, these guys, they need a hug, right? And I do kind of completely agree with you that looking at that as being a solution to the problem is incorrect. But I also think that one thing that we would argue is that the isolation of contemporary life is exacerbating these problems of extremism, and not just misogynistic extremism, but all forms of extremism, that we are living in these increasingly isolated lives that force us away from reality engaging kind of contexts. And I was wondering if, like, so I would say like one primary intervention that might work is any kind of social program that gets people away from their computers and gets them engaged in their community. That's something I think that, I always think of community gardening. When you think of how much we spend on warplanes and tanks and so on for security, I think investing in things like community gardens would be a great way of getting people out of their rooms and engaged, obviously post-incel, post-COVID. And I was just wondering if you see any point or any traction in the idea of, okay, isolation being a problem that contributes to this, or if you kind of see any attempt to deal with isolation as an underlying issue as counterproductive.
Well, Megan said that, not me.
Sorry.
So it was the recording with Megan, but I guess I can just kind of try to touch on this, right? So I think the larger concern that like Megan, Alex, and I had with all these recommendations of like, help incels get a girlfriend, like, you know, that doesn't mean that they won't inflict more violence within their relationship, because getting a girlfriend does not automatically mean that you're no longer a misogynist, right? Like domestic violence, intimate terrorism, all these things are very real. On average, once a week, a man in North America will murder his family and then kill himself, you know? And so obviously what we're pushing back against is obviously these recommendations that, you know, helping an incel get a girlfriend will automatically absolve them of their more violent impulses and tendencies. But that's obviously not the case, because we see how often women are subjected to violence within romantic relationships. You know, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States came out with a report that found that more than half of women who are murdered are killed by a current or former romantic partner. And so I think that's kind of the argument that we were making. Obviously, isolation does not help. You know, isolation is kind of like one of the worst things that can happen to a person, because we are all social creatures. And, you know, it's been even called the silent killer, loneliness, in many countries, right? But I think but like you all point out, like our society is designed towards like hyper individualistic and like loneliness. It's a kind of built for people to be lonely and fragmented and disengaged from their communities. But to just like, you know, think a community garden and a girlfriend is going to make someone stop being a misogynist will be a solution is also a little bit reductive too, right? Because it doesn't get to the structural and systemic problems that led us to this point. And so I think that's kind of the larger argument, that if we're going to really start more aggressively kind of like tackling these issues, we have to look at the systemic issues that lead to, you know, a man on average once a week killing his children and his wife and then himself. It's interesting that you bring this up, because Kate Mann wrote about this phenomenon and called it entitled shame. And so the larger issue is cis hetero white patriarchal masculinity, and the toxicity that breeds. And obviously like coming up with initiatives to, you know, help parents like raise boys that don't buy into that system can often be futile, because they learn it from cultural codes and schoolmates and everything else too. And so obviously, you know, solutions are really, really hard when we're thinking about them on a broader picture scale. And these solutions are so deeply embedded and intertwined into our society that sometimes it can be very overwhelming. But I think at least naming the issue and, you know, pushing back against, you know, get the incel a girlfriend as like kind of an end all be all solution is another avenue too, because there are people who are active on the incel forum who, like, despite like, you know, tension in the incel forum that if you like had a relationship, you can't be incel and can't be a part of us, they do come back to the forum because their relationships fall apart. You know, MGTOW is like a ton of dudes who are just really, really angry at women who used to be married, who had relationships and everything else. And even looking at the manifesto of Roy Den Hollander, most of it is a screed against his ex-wives. And so like, I think that highlights the complexity of misogyny and male supremacism in our broader society. And so like, and I know if Megan were here, she'd like, you know, talk more. I don't want to like speak on behalf of her, but these are my views and opinions. So, but I'm glad that we can have this kind of like dialogue with each other about these broader like societal issues, because, you know, in Japan and Korea, like the isolation and like the pressures of modern life create hikikomori and everything else. And so it's manifesting in ways across the globe that are resulting in violence or people basically locking themselves away from the world. And incel communities also embrace hikikomori lifestyles and becoming neats and everything else. It's a revolt against modern life. And obviously like the postmodern condition, collapse of grand narrative, leotard, etc., like make all these arguments, but it's something bigger than that. You know, that's what it feels like.
I think also I would add on that, like, this goes into our point about mental health and other kinds of support services, that we think a lot of these suggestions, like community spaces and other things, would be good for society, but that the people who are struggling are not just cisgender straight white men. In fact, they are not the most vulnerable population to depression and other mental health issues, but they are the population for who is most likely to commit acts of violence and mass violence. And so thinking about ways to continue to endorse things like, you know, yes, we should support community spaces and mental health services and support and all these kinds of things that we really need, but distinguishing that from, well, you know, women undergo these same kinds of isolation, and misogynist incels would say that's not true. Women can't be incels. Nobody suffers like we suffer. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the form was created by a woman. And so to deal with her own difficulty with finding sexual and romantic relationships. And so I think that it's important to recognize that incel, even men who self-identify as incel, do not have to find their way into the misogynist communities. There are still communities that are incel communities that are not misogynist ones, that have both men and women and open to non-binary people. There are communities like Forever Alone that have divorced themselves from using the term incel because they want to be a support community for people who would think of themselves as involuntarily celibate, but the word has been so tainted by this misogynist strain. And so distinguishing, you know, the reasons that they feel justified in committing violence, in dehumanizing women, and these other kinds of elements that are very similar to, and because we study male supremacism broadly, you know, if you take the same sort of base ideologies, but encourage them to learn techniques to manipulate and trick women into relationships or to coerce them into sex, then you have moved into the pickup artist and red pill field. And if you decide that, you know, you're dissatisfied and you want to just withdraw from society overall, you have moved into male separatist MGTOW field. Pickup artists haven't been behind mass violence, but they have been behind sexual violence. Men going their own way. The men's rights lawyer who targeted a federal judge and ended up killing her son, who had planned to kill multiple women federal judges, had also recently been involved in MGTOW forums, which have become more radical and use similar kind of violent language to misogynist incel forums. And so we think it's important to take it in that perspective, to take it in the perspective of anti-abortion violence, a different form of male supremacist violence, and thinking about those elements, and that is an area where if we just think about community and public health interventions, you know, as responses to groups that are committing violence, then we're reinforcing their own perspective of themselves as the only group that actually needs this, and giving that attention that way, and then not actually dealing with the underlying ideology that can manifest in, and we say moving from the public violence to private violence is not a success story. So having someone who might commit sexual violence or domestic abuse instead of perpetrating an ideological act of mass violence is not success, because for the harmed. Is there anything else from the panelists that they'd like to ask or follow up on? we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A now. So maybe I'll switch over first. So the first question is about what role does religious misogyny and mythology about sexual purity and sin play in mass murders of women, especially the Atlanta shooting? Julia, would you like to take that one?
So, I mean, this question is like the topic of many books, but I think multiple people have kind of asked about like morality and religiosity and misogyny and kind of like how those things are intertwined. I can see multiple questions in the chat, so I'm going to try to answer them as like, you know, succinctly as possible. This is not my main area of expertise. There are other people who study this, but research has shown that people who report feeling that they are addicted to pornography tend to be very, very religious. And so I think like ideas of sexual purity and sin, like they obviously play in a lot of violent attacks towards women, not just in mass murders, like what we saw with the Atlanta shooting, obviously rape culture and everything else. Like, you know, she was asking for it because of the way she was dressed, because she was drunk, like because she, like a woman violated these like sexual purity standards, like she deserved the violence that happened to her. These are pervasive discourses within our societies, but religious misogyny specifically justifies a lot of violence against women, like Alex pointed out with anti-abortion activists and everything else, and incel attacks. Even a lot of them, in Elliot Rodger's case, for instance, he actively wanted to punish people for being degenerate. And incel forums like use this term a lot, degeneracy, as a means of talking about the society that they feel like they do not belong in. And so it's not even just about punishing women who are degenerate, but also men who engage in these kinds of degenerate behaviors. These include drinking, sex before marriage, like, you know, going to clubs and bars, dressing provocatively. All of these things are things that they kind of like lambast and attack. And a lot of the time, like this is kind of tied up in this idea of like white Christian men being at the top of the hierarchy. I mean, this idea goes back to the Crusades. This isn't something that's modern at all. And so I think also too, but in our modern context, it's obviously influenced by Western ideas of racial hierarchy, Western ideas of purity, the Enlightenment, eugenics, everything else is kind of what influences this whole thing, as the white Christian man as the enforcer of morality. And we see this being played out time and time again in imperialism and colonialism too, right? And so I think this has a very long history, and there are a lot of articles that have been written about it that I'll happily share in the chat.
Yeah, I would say also what we see currently is that there's a more secular strain of misogyny than in the United States. We often focus on the Christian right, but that, as Julia talked about, it's still using these concepts of sexual purity and views of women that we're also accustomed to seeing in Christian patriarchy. And so, you know, we continue to have the case of the shootings in Tuesday, given the language that the perpetrator used in his background, it seems like it might have been more directly influenced by beliefs within conservative Christianity. But the overall kind of concepts of sexual purity and sin are so pervasive in society that even a more secularized movement continues to use those concepts. Let's see. The next question. So this is somewhat related around the concept of morality. The idea of white men who think they are the ones who should enforce morality. Thinking about, for instance, the Turner Diaries, which
I tried to answer that question as like a combined thing.
Combine them, yeah.
A long time.
So I think that was answered to an extent, but just I think putting a little bit more of the focus on the white supremacist and racially impure nature of it as well. And and that is part of what we see in the Turner Diaries, that they choose their targets for what is called the Day of the Rope, that they think are not only racially impure, but sexually improper. And in the United States, because of the January 6th attacks, the Turner Diaries novel, with its fantasizing, for anyone not familiar with the novel, of a future sort of white nationalist takeover of society, gained a lot of attention. And so I think that's one of the interrelated issues between white supremacism and other forms of male supremacism as well. Let's see. So we have a few different questions related to what do we do about this? One asking about specifically, because these groups connect and communicate online, what are concrete intervention strategies that organizations, community leaders, and/or tech companies can employ? One that is asking that, are there things that lay people can do to recognize red flags or to intervene and inspire changes in individuals in their life? And a third one asking about whether there are other kinds of targeted interventions from a mental health and psycholinguistic perspective that directly address and speak to them effectively and address their misogynist narratives and suggest other kinds of narratives that would counter that. And I think that that I see that Tal was interested in answering one of these questions.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First off, I wanted to answer the securitize. What is it to securitize? And to securitize, when something is securitized, it means the state recognizes a threat as an existential threat, as a threat. So we've securitized in relation to COVID generally around the world, like we've understood COVID to be this kind of existential threat for the state. And so that has allowed the state to release policy mechanisms and resources in order to keep their population safe from this security threat. So that's what securitization is. And it's essentially just a speech act to say we are securitizing malaria, we are securitizing Islamic extremism, because we're saying that that is a threat to this state. And we need to unleash resources and a strong policy stance, and in some sense, a kind of cross-party kind of alliance against this particular threat. We're not going to politicize it because it is an existential threat. Whether or not that's ever possible, I don't know in the United States. But that, so just to be clear, that this is what we're talking about, is we're saying we need to address misogynistic violence and extremism, misogyny itself, as an existential threat to the safety of the state. And I also wanted to say, well, I could, because it was to the same question, I'm not saying that community gardens would be the only response here. What I'm saying is, if we can spend, and in the US, it's an amazing amount of money. In Australia, we spend $130 million per plane on a plane that costs $80,000 per hour to fly, to protect us against a foreign threat that we haven't encountered, and I can't see encountering anytime soon. But we believe that is a security threat. And yet what do we sink into addressing misogyny as a security threat? Well, pretty much next to nothing specifically. So the point is to kind of say, look, we need to think more broadly about what security means as a state. I think states need to think more broadly about security and identify that the security threats that people face aren't necessarily foreigners. They are, well, often husbands and work colleagues, unfortunately. That's the kind of security that actually concerns most people. in this country. That's the biggest security threat. So it's about re-identifying that and then thinking, okay, what can we, if we thought about that security threat on the same level as we think about foreign people and foreign armies, then where would we put the money and where will we put the resources and what would we do differently? And I think, yes, community gardens isn't going to solve the problem, but it's that kind of thinking. It's that kind of thinking about how can we address these issues of, in this case, isolation and misogyny on in a fundamental level as a priority that matters. Now, in terms of the other questions about what can be done, well, sociolinguistic programming has been shown to work, and I think we referenced I think it's Diezeniga. I don't have my paper in front of it, but this kind of neurolinguistic programming where you take people through scenarios where they might be thinking about pursuing a particular course of action, and then you take them through the implications of that action and then take them again through another course of actions where they make better choices. That has been shown in domestic violence and abuse situations to be incredibly effective. So that kind of intervention is like a secondary intervention. If you can spot people who are at risk of radicalizing, at risk of being misogynist, then that is really useful. It's definitely something you can pursue. Even though this will seem redundant, there's a lot of social psychology papers out there showing that if you engage with misogynistic groups online and you say misogynistic things to your friends, you are more likely to be misogynist and commit misogynistic violence. So in terms of what individuals can do, if you hear somebody saying something that is misogynistic, pull them up on that, clear that up and just kind of say, actually, you know, when you just said that thing, and sometimes it can sound pretty like innocuous. It might be along the lines of, oh, they should be, you know, our Prime Minister just did this. We've got an Attorney General who is accused of rape. And so we had a protest march on the weekend where, you know, hundreds of thousands of people protested the treatment of women in Australia. The government, the Prime Minister, who is our president, came out and said, well, you know, these women, they're basically lucky because not too far away you'd get shot for protesting, and they should be glad that they live in a free country like Australia. Now that, even though it seems like a statement of fact, it actually contains this kind of misogynistic threat. And I really think we need to pull that up. It's like, no, they couldn't get shot. It's disgusting to even imply that that is a condition upon protest. It's a possibility from protest. You wouldn't say if it was men. Okay, and pulling people up on those kind of speech acts when they happen I think is something that everybody can do. Just to kind of get it clear when it's like, okay, if what you're saying isn't okay to say about men, then it's also not okay to say about women, and just make sure we're always doing that. I probably have lost some of the other things.
I think that's fine.
But yes, I think, sorry, Alex.
Oh yeah, I think that was very comprehensive, and I really appreciate some of the points about securitization. And you know, I had not started this work expecting, when I was working on male supremacism, to be working so much in the CVE and counterterrorism spheres, but since they get so much funding, engaging with those fields and trying to redirect, as you and Sian have talked about, from secondary to primary interventions, from this 11th hour kind of de-radicalization to thinking about structural changes, I think is really valuable for all of us. Julia or Sian, do you want to add on these questions about what to do? Sian, go ahead.
If you don't mind, I'm not an expert in like the way that these social media platforms and things work, but I can sort of touch on a bit of the question that was about what can tech companies do. And we find that it's difficult. Like for a while, a big incel forum I was looking at was the subreddit, and Reddit banned the incel subreddit not super long ago. I think it was only a year and a half ago or so. And that was kind of interesting for a few reasons, because it becomes very controversial regarding like, okay, what subreddits does Reddit ban? You know, there's some, okay, they'll ban the incel subreddit, but then there's all these other really horrific ones that exist. I'm sure, you know, like fat people hate and all these really disgraceful subreddits that are permitted to continue. So then when things like that happen, it becomes a discussion of like, why is this one allowed to stay and why is this one not allowed to be here? As well, I know when it got deleted, quite quickly, another subreddit appeared that was kind of like the new one for the people who used to be on the incel subreddit to migrate to. And that got shut down relatively quickly. It became fairly obvious what it was. I guess what I mean is it's difficult for tech companies with different platforms because they'll just pop up in different places. And a similar thing, Tal's been doing a bit more work on this than me, but I've been touching on it, looking at COVID and with the way people share misinformation. And even if Tal's done some work on Facebook, you know, you can't search for anti-vax groups, for example, but people are sharing that material on WhatsApp. So it's very difficult in terms of, I guess, social media platforms and tech, in that it can just pop up in so many places. And, you know, you have the incel forum and things like that, which it makes it very challenging. The other thing I just wanted to mention, which is not quite related to that, was that there are some articles by the BBC and they interviewed some ex-incels. I found one of the articles, I'll put it in the chat in case anyone's interested. There are some others I can't find at the moment. Just talking about how people felt like really insecure. They felt, oh, I'm ugly, I can't find a woman, I can't talk to women, and then how they get on the incel forum and then they're sort of surrounded by this extreme language and these kind of extreme views, and it feels a bit more normal. Like, it doesn't feel like there's people saying, hey, that's a crazy thing to say, why are you saying this? They're in this community where it's fueling and kind of getting more and more severe. That was in another article, I'll see if I can find it, but in particular, this person said, you know, once I went on there, no one was calling out what these people were saying and they were just acting like it was normal. And then you said something to somebody else in real life that was related to what was spoken about on the forum, and someone said, hey, like that's a crazy thing to say. So I guess a bit like what Tal was saying, it's that the issue where these people feeling so insecure and so angry at the world and hating women, they end up getting their views radicalized online in these spaces. It's a filter bubble, right? And then without that person pulling you out of that filter bubble in real life, it's quite difficult to get that outside perspective, I suppose. I hope that made sense.
I would also like to point out that
Yeah,
incels
Julia.
actually got banned from Reddit in 2017. And I know this because I was in the middle of field work when it happened. So
What a nightmare.
that date is etched in my brain forever.
Wow.
Julia, did you want to respond to anything else on that question?
I think it's very, very complex. And I think Sean kind of touched on a lot of the things, but, you know, a lot of my dissertation was about deplatforming, and it's exceedingly complex because it's so easy to just migrate somewhere else. And so just because that like these groups aren't on these major platforms anymore doesn't mean that they're not finding ways to circumnavigate these bans and a variety of methods, like Sean pointed out with WhatsApp, or even Facebook Messenger isn't moderated and everything else. Or they find ways to kind of like, you know, hide the content in like other groups, which is why QAnon and anti-vaxxing content flourishes in like mommy groups and, you know, like healthy living and yoga groups and everything else. It's being spread there. So shutting down the group does nothing to actually mitigate the content because the users are all still there. So a platform is very, very reticent to ban a user completely because, you know, usually that doesn't happen unless in cases of like illegal activity, but the users are all still there and they're finding ways to share this information, often by using the platform's logic against itself. And so I think it's a really, really complex issue because online platforms for years refused to do anything about it until very recently. And some people are wondering, is it too little too late? It's kind of uncertain. My book talks about this, which will be like, I don't know if it'll come out ever, but it's under review right now. So
we look forward to that. I also want to add, going back to the various sort of root causes with these for interventions. So certainly practicing, feminist, anti-racist language and, speech like that is something that everybody can do. But also many of the decisions about education are actually made on a very local level. In the United States, the right wing has made a really concerted effort to focus on the educational system, from issues like abstinence-only education, which I mentioned before, which perpetuates a lot of these misogynist stereotypes and beliefs and is very problematic on consent, to the recent attacks and ongoing attacks on critical race theory. And so individuals as well can be involved wherever they are in their local school districts and local governments, and thinking about where some of those spheres are, or, certainly also for anyone who's in media, we have specific tips about how to speak there. The No Notoriety campaign has advice as well for individuals. So I think that actually there's a lot that can be done at the roots that, really relies on grassroots intervention for social justice, that actually a really effective response to male supremacism and its intersections with white supremacism and other kinds of issues, trans misogyny being a big part of that. So much can really be done in your local community. And so thinking about that in that framework. Our next question is a really great one that I'm thrilled to answer because I think that this terminology is important. Could you talk more about the recommendation to distinguish incel identity from misogynist incel ideology? Is there a risk that separation might further encourage members of misogynist incel forums to claim and maybe believe that they are not that kind of incel? So actually, I think it's the opposite. So what we have seen in our research is these forums that are very blatantly misogynist are clearly part of a misogynist incel movement and ideology that are influenced by the Santa Barbara 2014 Mass Killers Manifesto and other, concepts around the Black pill and that they have elaborated on these forums. They say, and are very firm about this, that they're not an ideology and they're not a movement, that they're just an identity. That only men can be incels, not women, and a man just is an incel, and being an incel means basically how they are as an incel, which is, beliefs that this is an injustice and the dehumanization and all of those kinds of things. And so the concept that inceldom, as they sometimes use the term, is just an identity, is not an ideology, is actually what they have been using to keep themselves from being recognized as interventions are using the term incel itself. I saw an article where a reporter had done a really excellent, actually, report on a support community for incels that was for both men and women and wasn't particularly misogynist. But so the outcome of her report was like, oh, like incels are like this, we shouldn't see them with this framework we have about thinking of like misogynist violence. And when I read this article, I was like, yeah, that's an incel support community. That's not a part of the misogynist incel movement. We really need to separate these, because otherwise we have a misperception and we have an assumption, because media will talk about incel and they really just mean these particular men only misogynist incel forums. And so they'll talk about it like, if you are, a man who does not have the sexual relationships than you desire, then you automatically must end up having this deeply misogynist, dehumanizing entitlement, self-perception of victimhood. And actually, there are plenty of men who either self-identify as incels or, or are dissatisfied, do not have sexual experience, who do not go in that direction. And so that's why this has been a particularly important element of how I've promoted this. And I think it's extra important now, and I'm not repeating the name of the forum on the webinar, but the one in the recording, with the one mentioned is sort of the main one that would be called sort of the primary example of what a misogynist incel forum is. And that very forum has been, its administrator has been at the forefront recently of attempting to, claiming that inceldom is just an identity and therefore they're being maligned, and trying to gain legitimacy for his movement, and having successful collaborators from the countering violent extremism sphere who have given him a platform for his speech, even though he is an administrator of a site that traffics in misogynist rhetoric, dehumanizing terminology, like Megan spoke about early in the recording, and glorifying and promoting acts of mass violence. And so this is something that is really kind of what I see as one of the most important interventions around this kind of shift in language, that it actually is the agenda of the misogynist incel leaders themselves, the administrators of the sites, to try to make it seem as though this is just something that is, part of their sense of biological essentialism. This is just how things are, and that they don't want to be seen as, no, like what this is an ideology, because an ideology can be justifiably critiqued, and it is different from just what someone's else on that question from the other panelists. So we had a question about what college students can do if they want to do research in this area. And so I will mention that the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, in addition to our fellowship program for experts, we have a mentoring program which is geared towards emerging researchers at the level of having a project that they will be working on over the next year. And we have also been working on, and hopefully we'll be able to have soon, another collective where people who are not at the stage of being part of the mentoring program but are interested in this topic could possibly participate. And we will be starting to teach some online classes in this area starting in the summer, because there are very few universities who work on the subject of male supremacism. And so I encourage people to look at our website and for resources. Are there any other any thoughts from our other panelists at their institutions?
Yeah, if you come to Australia, we're always interested in this. My colleague Mel Johnson as well specialises in this area in Melbourne as also. So obviously we're in Australia, but always interested in this area.
So the next question, Julia, did you want to take this one about how someone can consider themselves involuntarily celibate or an incel without there being an implicit entitlement to sex present?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to highlight that, when Alana started the Involuntary Celibate Project, it was more about, it was less about like this entitlement to sex, but more about like, sharing like loneliness with other people who were trying to pursue romantic relationships or sexual relationships, but for whatever reason just weren't successful. And so I think it's, there are groups like Forever Alone and Incels Without Hate and stuff like that who try to kind of like, be support groups for people who are suffering from this kind of loneliness. And I think that's like where like that the tension is, right? Because incel like automatically means like misogynistic man who feels that he's entitled to sex, but it's it has like a deeper and longer history of and I think also too that's what makes studying these groups really hard, because obviously like people want to feel like they belong, like most people want to be loved, most people want to have relationships, but there are people who fail in that regard, and like there are a lot of failures and rejection is rife, but they're not reasons to become misogynistic and to inflict violence upon others. And so I think like there is obviously kind of a slippery slope, but I think that's kind of the point that we're making, that violent incels, violent misogynistic incels and incels like do exist on a spectrum. And so I think it's important to kind of realize that, it comes in a lot of different forms, and loneliness is a factor, but it's not the only factor in someone becoming a misogynistic incel. Um, and so I think like, obviously, when we look at these kinds of things, we have to look at all of their complexity. I think that's kind of the point that I wanted to make.
I think it might also be useful to add that involuntarily celibate is an academic term originally, that the term is meant to distinguish someone who has purposely decided to be celibate, like a Catholic priest, for instance, who takes a vow of celibacy, from somebody who is who would like to be sexually active but is not. And so the involuntary, the term involuntary is not implicitly about because somebody else is depriving me of this. It's about the person's, the person's own choices and desires, that they would like to be sexually active, and the support group is to try to figure that out to a better extent. How could they form? And the original support group was more focused on romantic relationships than just sexual relationships, as we, the misogynist incel movement is to an extent. And so that this academic parlance that the term comes from, I think is, is part of why the terminology seems a little weird. There is also a question about related, whether calling it only misogynistic incel risks obscuring other matrices of domination that are practiced frequently among them, such as racist and ableist structures. So the term, we came up with misogynist incels based on the construction racist skinhead. That is like a similar kind of construction. Just to modify the term with misogynist to understand this difference. A racist skinhead, most racist skinheads are also misogynist and also have other aspects of issues. And so it's not intended to obscure that, but to indicate that the primary motivation of this ideology is misogynist. And then with any kind of misogyny, racism, any kind of supremacist, prejudiced ideology is always intertwined with other supremacist and prejudiced ideologies. And we take an intersectional approach to our research. And so I don't feel that it's the case that, when we distinguish a group that is primarily white supremacist, it is also typically misogynist, anti-LGBT, ableist, but that their core ideological motivation is racism. And so that's what we look at in these groups. And then when we talk about groups broadly, We might talk about a group that this group is male supremacist and white supremacist and anti-Semitic and anti-trans. Like there are ways that you would define elements of the group. And within misogynist incels, and one of the reasons separating out male supremacism is relevant is that there are the misogynist incel community in particular has a significant participation of men of color. And so it is a movement that you can see elements of racism and white supremacism in it, but it is more complex and works in different kinds of ways. And so the terminology, puts it essentially kind of more in line with some of the other names that movements use for themselves, like men's rights activists and men going their own way, which are also movements that tend to, again, have elements of white supremacism and other kinds of prejudices, but that this is their core kind of organizing element. And I do think that that intersectional perspective that we incorporate into our work and our mission statement at the Institute is a really vital part of it. And because we were focused in the report that we wrote mostly on acts of violence themselves, we didn't go in as deeply into the dynamics of race and class in the movement. But that other research that we do delves more deeply into that, and particularly the particular misogynist and racist elements of their focus on Asian women as the group that they tend to have the most specific dehumanizing slurs for, racist slurs for, on a particular kind of element of that focus as a wing of the movement, in addition to their obsession with whiteness and white women as the standard, the most appealing standard for them. Anything else on that question from our panelists? Great, so let's see, I'm not sure I fully understand this question, but do you observe a connection with familiar problems or traumas? Do any of the panelists feel like they could understand and could answer that?
I think that they're talking about as in traumas within the family. And yeah, I mean, the basic research is that yes, that is a risk factor. That if you're subjected to violence and you experience violence in the household, you're much more likely, in terms of incel violence, you're much more likely to go and commit violence as well. That's just a general rule. It's not specific to incels necessarily. It's just a rule for all people who are likely to be violent, that experience in the violence in the family and within your community is more likely to result in you becoming or seeing violence as a way of solving problems or expressing yourself. So yes, the answer is yes, but it's there's a lot of other layers, but that would definitely be one to look for as a red flag. Part of our approach was looking at like at the secondary stage, where you're looking at people who might radicalize. You look at all these different indicators that might suggest that they are likely to both be misogynist and engage in violence, and that's one for engaging in violence. And of course, then there's speech acts and so on as well.
And so if anyone has further questions for the Q&A, pop them in now quickly. We have one more of a comment that's just agreeing with the comments about distinguishing incel versus misogynist incel. That highlights, which I think is worth reinforcing, that so much of the media discussion about incels is focused on mocking incels for failed masculinity in the form of sexual conquest, which does nothing to challenge the underlying ideology. And I think that that is an element that when we talk about the spectrum of misogyny and male supremacism, that misogynist incels are themselves one form of misogyny, and the idea of tying in sexual conquest and masculinity is another form of misogyny and male supremacism, both of which ideologies make women vulnerable to potential violence and are based on men's beliefs in their entitlement to women's bodies. So I appreciate that comment being added. So to wrap up, I think I'd like to just ask if there's any parting words that each of the panelists would like to leave us with in summing up this really great discussion. Yes, go ahead and start, Tal.
Just on that subject, your media guide for how to address this content is excellent. And one of the issues we had when we released our research is we did like a think piece through the conversation, which is like a digital newspaper, and they wanted to dress it up. Do you know what I mean? They wanted to dress it up as these lonely losers. And then all the comments just wanted to discuss, oh, these boys who can't get a girlfriend, completely unproductive in both addressing the issue and also, it creates a feeling of persecution amongst the community. So just to reflect upon that and how we deal with this, it's problematic. And again, I can't commend your media guide enough. I think that's excellent, because it's really problematic how to discuss this in a way that's productive without creating more of a sense of alienation and victimhood within incels. And again, for the same reason, just to reflect on how big tech can help, I don't think necessarily eliminating the forums is that useful. What we want to see is more curation and guidance through those forums. The research suggests, this is Horgan, that community leaders that have thought more about their actions and have reformed are actually the best voices for encouraging further reformation from other participants. So I think in some ways allowing more publicity to shine on this and just being really careful about how we engage with that community and how we help them police themselves is probably the solution.
Well, thank you so much for that plug to our media guide. We really appreciate it. So for the people who are joining us live, we'll be sending out an email after the event to attendees with all of the links to things that have been mentioned today. And if you are watching us on YouTube after this is recorded, those links will be found in the description of the video on the YouTube site. So other final remarks from our two other panelists?
I mean, I guess I would just like to, highlight the fact that we can't understand these issues without an intersectional lens. And in light of everything that's happened in the past year and all these different attacks and everything else, we're obviously seeing an increase in violence because these systemic issues in our society are merely increasing as we're becoming more and more individuated and isolated, and it's just not sustainable. And I think it's important that all of us have this space to talk to each other and to share with each other. And the research that we're doing is really difficult, but thank you all for doing what you do. And thank you all for coming to this webinar.
I guess one thing that comes to mind that I'm thinking is something that we've struggled with when writing the article, but also when talking to people about this issue. And it does relate to what Tal said about the way that the media talks about this kind of thing, is that I feel like in the way that I talk about this stuff, there's a constant struggle between being like, let's try to understand how people are feeling and why they're doing what they're doing and saying what they're saying, versus like absolving them of their kind of behavior. So I guess I feel like it's important to recognize that, like, trying to understand why people feel the way I feel and saying, yes, they feel terrible about themselves and that's a societal problem, or that understanding that isn't saying that we think, okay, great, that means you can go out and do these crazy, horrible, disgusting attacks. It's just a way of, like, you know, to address the issue, you have to try to understand where people are coming from. And I think, yeah, in terms of media, in terms of how we talk about it with different people, that's something, that constant sort of tension that we've had to deal with. And yeah, it's been wonderful to talk to you guys about this issue, because we have had some discussions, of course, but not with people so specifically interested in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. Yes, and I want to thank again the Center for Right-Wing Studies, who's co-sponsoring with us. As someone who comes from right-wing studies scholarship myself, that kind of tension and sometimes overcorrection that people have with what they going from trying to understand a group to actually over sympathizing with a group, and that you can walk a line as a researcher that, you know, talks about things seriously and appropriately, and I too have had difficulty occasionally with media paraphrasing my words and terminology that I would never use as a researcher. And so that's part of what that speaks to. And so I think that, you know, we are constantly trying to navigate these issues. So I'm so appreciative of our panelists for joining us today for this conversation. And I really encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to read the report that we published between the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism and New America, and to read also our separate one-page media guide on the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism website itself. And we also encourage support for and donations to the Institute. We at the Institute mostly run it as volunteers because we think that this topic is important on top of whatever other positions that we have in our everyday work life. And we really rely on support from others in order to be able to provide things like a supportive community for researchers and digital security services and training and other things. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our co-hosts. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day wherever you are based in the world.